The morning sun cast long shadows across the reinforced concrete walls of Haven Base, humanity's last known sanctuary in a world overrun by the undead. Commander Sarah Chen stood atop the watchtower, her weathered hands gripping the rail as she surveyed the perimeter through binoculars. The electric fence hummed with deadly voltage, a sound that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat over the past 3 years. Beyond the wire, the wasteland stretched endlessly, dotted with the shambling figures of zombies that never tired, never gave up their relentless pursuit of the living. "Ma'am, we've got movement on the eastern sector," reported Lieutenant Marcus Webb, his voice crackling through the radio. Sarah adjusted her view, focusing on a massive horde emerging from the ruins of what used to be downtown. There were hundreds of them, maybe thousands, moving with an unusual coordination that made her stomach clench with dread. These weren't the random wanderers they'd grown accustomed to. This was something different, something organized. Inside the base, life continued with the mechanical precision of survival. Dr. Elena Vasquez worked tirelessly in the medical bay, tending to the wounded from yesterday's supply run. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she sutured a deep gash on Private Johnson's arm, the result of a too-close encounter with a zombie's clawing fingers. The base housed nearly 800 survivors, from hardened military personnel to civilian families who'd managed to reach safety before the walls went up. Each person had a role, a purpose that kept the fragile ecosystem of their sanctuary functioning. The children attended makeshift classes in the converted mess hall, their laughter a bittersweet reminder of the world they'd lost. Teacher and former librarian Mrs. Patterson did her best to maintain some semblance of normalcy, though the textbooks had been replaced with lessons on basic first aid and emergency protocols. Even the youngest understood that their playground was surrounded by death, that the games they played were preparation for a reality no child should have to face. In the armory, Chief Warrant Officer Tommy Rodriguez conducted his daily inventory with religious dedication. Ammunition was life in their world, and every bullet had to be accounted for. The recent supply runs had been increasingly dangerous, with zombie activity growing more aggressive and coordinated. The creatures seemed to be learning, adapting, and that terrified him more than he'd ever admit to the others. He'd been military for 20 years before the outbreak, but nothing had prepared him for this endless siege. The base's power came from a combination of solar panels and a diesel generator that burned through their carefully rationed fuel. Engineer Lisa Park monitored the systems from the control room, her multiple screens displaying power consumption, structural integrity, and external sensor data. The technology that kept them alive was aging, and replacement parts were becoming impossible to find. Every day brought new challenges, new failures that required creative solutions with dwindling resources. As afternoon approached, Sarah called together her senior staff for the daily briefing. The meeting room was sparse, functional, with maps covering every wall showing zombie movement patterns, resource locations, and potential escape routes they all hoped never to use. The faces around the table had grown harder over the years, etched with the weight of impossible decisions and the constant pressure of keeping everyone alive. "The horde I spotted this morning is definitely headed our way," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "Estimated arrival time is 36 hours, maybe less. We need to prepare for the possibility that this isn't just another random migration." She paused, meeting each person's eyes. "I think someone or something is directing them." The implications hung heavy in the air. If the zombies were being controlled, if there was intelligence behind their movements, then everything they thought they knew about survival had changed. Dr. Vasquez leaned forward, her scientific mind racing through possibilities. "The mutation rate has been increasing. We've seen zombies with enhanced strength, improved coordination. Maybe they're evolving some form of collective intelligence." Lieutenant Webb shifted uncomfortably. "Whatever's happening, our current defenses might not be enough. The eastern wall has been showing stress fractures, and if they hit us with everything they've got..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. They all knew what happened when a stronghold fell. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, turning the dusty ground to mud. The weather would slow the approaching horde, but it would also make their own defensive preparations more difficult. Sarah stood, her decision made. "We have 36 hours to turn this base into an impregnable fortress. Every person, every resource, every idea we've got goes into keeping those walls standing. Because if we fall, there might not be anyone left to remember what humanity used to be." The moment Sarah's briefing ended, Haven Base erupted into controlled chaos. The 36-hour countdown had begun, and every second counted in their desperate race against death. The base's public address system crackled to life as Sarah's voice echoed through every corridor, workshop, and living quarter. All personnel, this is Commander Chin. We are now under Code Red protocols. This is not a drill. Report to your assigned stations immediately. In the armory, Chief Rodriguez found himself surrounded by a sea of anxious faces as civilians lined up alongside military personnel to receive their weapon assignments. Mrs. Patterson, the former librarian who now taught the children, stood nervously before him with trembling hands. "I've never fired a gun in my life, Tommy," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the din of activity. Rodriguez placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder as he handed her a lightweight pistol. "Today you learned, Sarah. The children are counting on all of us." He spent precious minutes showing her the basics, knowing that her steady hands that once turned book pages might soon need to pull a trigger to save innocent lives. The engineering bay buzzed with frantic energy as Lisa Park directed teams of volunteers in reinforcing the base's weakest points. Welding torches sparked against metal as they added extra steel plating to the eastern wall where the stress fractures had appeared. The acrid smell of hot metal filled the air, mixing with the tension that seemed to permeate every breath. "We need more materials," Lisa shouted over the noise to her assistant, Jake Morrison, a former construction worker who'd become invaluable since the outbreak. "Strip everything non-essential. Light fixtures, bed frames, anything metal that can be welded into place." Dr. Vasquez worked tirelessly to prepare the medical bay for the casualties she knew were coming. Her small team of nurses and medics organized supplies with military precision, setting up triage areas and emergency surgical stations. The base's limited medical supplies were carefully rationed, each bandage and antibiotic dose potentially meaning the difference between life and death. She caught herself thinking about the children, wondering if they'd have enough sedatives to ease their suffering if the worst came to pass. The thought made her hands shake as she loaded syringes, forcing herself to focus on the mechanical task rather than the horrific possibilities. In the mess hall, the debate that had been simmering since the morning briefing finally boiled over. A group of 30 civilians, led by accountant-turned-supply manager David Kim, argued passionately for immediate evacuation. "We have vehicles, fuel and supplies," Kim insisted, his face flushed with emotion. "We could be 50 miles away before those things reach the walls. Why are we gambling with our children's lives?" His words found support among several families who'd lost loved ones in previous zombie encounters. Sergeant Maria Santos, a decorated veteran who'd lost her entire unit in the early days of the outbreak, stood to counter his argument. "Run where, David? Every other stronghold we've had contact with has fallen. The roads are death traps and winter's coming. We leave those walls and we're not survivors anymore, we're just postponing the inevitable." Her voice carried the weight of experience, of battles fought and comrades lost. "At least here we have a chance to make our stand count for something." The argument grew heated as more voices joined in, the stress of the approaching horde fracturing the unity that had kept them alive for 3 years. Children pressed their faces against the windows, watching their parents and protectors argue while the sun continued its relentless march across the sky. Time was slipping away, and every minute spent in debate was a minute not spent preparing for battle. Commander Chin arrived just as the shouting reached its peak. Her presence immediately quieted the room, her authority earned through countless life and death decisions. "I understand your fear," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the mess hall. "I feel it too. But we've survived this long because we've stood together. If we run now, we scatter to the winds, and those families out there in the wasteland never have a chance to find safety. We're not just fighting for our lives, we're fighting to keep hope alive." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "Anyone who wants to leave can take a vehicle and supplies. No judgment, no shame. But for those who stay, we make this place a fortress that no zombie horde can breach. We show them that humanity doesn't just survive, we fight back." Her words galvanized the room, reminding everyone of what they were truly defending. As the debate settled, the base returned to its frantic preparations. The approaching darkness seemed to mock their efforts, bringing them closer to a battle that would determine whether humanity's light would continue to shine or be extinguished forever. Outside the walls, the first zombies of the advanced scouts began to appear on the horizon, their shambling forms silhouetted against the dying sun. The attack came at dawn, just as the first rays of sunlight painted the eastern sky in shades of crimson that seemed to prophesy the bloodshed ahead. Commander Chin stood in the command center, surrounded by monitors displaying feeds from cameras positioned along the perimeter. What she saw made her blood run cold. The zombie horde wasn't the mindless mass they'd expected. It moved with purpose, dividing into coordinated groups that approached the base from multiple angles simultaneously. "Contact eastern perimeter." Lieutenant Webb's voice crackled through the radio from his position on the wall. "They're using the abandoned vehicles as cover, advancing in formation." The impossibility of his words hung in the air like a death sentence. Zombies didn't use tactics. They didn't understand cover. Yet there they were, moving with the discipline of trained soldiers, using the rusted hulks of cars and trucks to shield themselves from the base's machine gun positions. Private Johnson, his arms still bandaged from the previous day's encounter, squinted through his rifle scope at the approaching undead. Something was wrong with their movement patterns. These weren't the stumbling, uncoordinated creatures they'd fought before. These zombies moved with fluid precision, and some of them, God help them all, some of them were carrying crude weapons. Broken pipes, chunks of concrete, pieces of rebar that they wielded with disturbing competence. The first wave hit the eastern wall with the force of a hurricane. The electric fence sparked and sizzled as dozens of zombies threw themselves against it, their bodies convulsing as thousands of volts coursed through them. But instead of falling back, more zombies piled onto their electrocuted companions, using the still twitching bodies as insulation to breach the barrier. The tactical display showed Lisa Park's worst fears coming true. The power grid was overloading, sections of the fence failing as the zombies literally sacrificed themselves to create gaps in the defenses. "They're shorting out the fence deliberately," Lisa shouted into her headset from the control room, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she tried to reroute power to maintain the barriers. "This isn't random. They know exactly what they're doing." The implication sent a chill through everyone listening. If the zombies understood their defenses well enough to systematically disable them, then every contingency plan they'd made was potentially worthless. Dr. Vasquez watched from the medical bay window as the first casualties began arriving. But what she saw outside defied everything she thought she knew about zombie behavior. A group of the creatures had formed what could only be described as a primitive assembly line, passing chunks of concrete and debris to build crude ramps against the wall. They worked together with an efficiency that reminded her of ant colonies, each zombie playing its part in a larger strategy. The sound of automatic weapons fire echoed across the base as the defenders opened up on the approaching horde. Muzzle flashes lit up the dawn like deadly fireworks, and the air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the metallic tang of blood. Sergeant Santos directed fire teams with practiced precision, but even her veteran experience couldn't fully prepare her for what they were facing. "Concentrate fire on the tool users," she barked into her radio. "Take down the ones carrying weapons first." In the mess hall, the children huddled together under Mrs. Patterson's watchful eye, their makeshift classroom transformed into a shelter. The sound of battle filtered through the reinforced walls, punctuated by explosions as the defenders detonated pre-placed charges to collapse zombie-built ramps. 8-year-old Emma Chin, the commander's daughter, pressed her hands against her ears but couldn't block out the sounds of warfare. "Are the bad ones going to get in?" she whispered to Mrs. Patterson, who fought to keep her voice steady as she replied, "Your mother and the others won't let that happen, sweetheart." The breakthrough came at the southern wall, where a group of zombies had somehow acquired a battering ram, a telephone pole they carried with coordinated precision. The impact sent shockwaves through the base's structure, and hairline cracks appeared in the concrete. Chief Rodriguez arrived at the breach point with a team of volunteers, including David Kim, who'd chosen to stay and fight despite his earlier arguments for evacuation. "Whatever these things have become," Rodriguez shouted over the noise of battle, "they still go down when you put enough bullets in them." But as the first zombie clambered through a gap in the wall, Rodriguez saw something that made his blood freeze. The creature's eyes held a spark of intelligence, a calculating awareness that tracked the defender's movements with predatory focus. It raised its makeshift weapon, a sharpened piece of rebar, and let out a sound that was part roar, part battle cry, completely unlike the mindless moaning they'd grown accustomed to. The zombie apocalypse had just evolved, and humanity's last stronghold was about to face an enemy that could think, plan, and adapt. The real battle was only beginning. The southern wall's breach widened like a festering wound as more zombies poured through the gap, their coordinated assault overwhelming the hastily assembled defense team. Chief Rodriguez emptied his magazine into the advancing horde, each shot finding its mark but barely slowing their relentless advance. The zombies moved with terrifying purpose, some wielding crude shields made from car doors while others flanked around the debris with tactical precision that made his military training seem inadequate. "Fall back to checkpoint Alpha," Rodriguez commanded, his voice hoarse from shouting orders over the chaos. David Kim, who'd never fired a weapon in anger before yesterday, fumbled with his rifle's reload mechanism as a zombie with glowing, intelligent eyes advanced toward him. The The creature's face bore fresh scars that formed almost deliberate patterns, and it carried a sharpened stop sign like a medieval sword. Kim's hands shook as he finally chambered a round, but the zombie was already too close. The blast came from Rodriguez's shotgun, sending the intelligent zombie sprawling backward. "Stay close to me, Kim," he shouted, grabbing the terrified accountant by the shoulder. "These things are hunting in packs now." They retreated toward the inner compound, but Rodriguez couldn't shake the feeling that they were being herded rather than simply pursued. The zombies' movements were too organized, too strategic for creatures that should have been driven by nothing but hunger. In the command center, Commander Chen watched the tactical display with growing horror. The breach at the southern wall was expanding, but more disturbing were the reports coming in from other sections. "Ma'am, we're seeing coordinated probing attacks all along the perimeter," Lieutenant Webb reported, his voice tight with stress. "They're not just trying to break through, they're testing our response times, our defensive capabilities. It's like they're gathering intelligence." The realization hit Chen like a physical blow. The zombies weren't just randomly attacking. They were conducting reconnaissance, learning the base's weaknesses with each assault. But how was that possible? The answer came in the form of a blood-curdling scream from the communications room. Chen sprinted toward the sound, her sidearm drawn, only to find communications specialist Janet Mueller backed against the wall, her face pale with terror. "Commander, you need to see this," Mueller stammered, pointing at the bank of monitors displaying external camera feeds. On screen after screen, zombies were positioning themselves at strategic points around the base, but they weren't attacking. They were waiting, watching, as if receiving instructions from some unseen commander. They've been moving into position for the past hour, but they're not advancing. It's like they're planning something. The horrifying truth crystallized in Chen's mind just as the lights flickered and died. Emergency power kicked in a moment later, bathing the command center in red light, but the damage was done. Someone had cut the main power lines from inside the base. The betrayal she'd feared most had finally materialized. There was a traitor among them, someone who'd been helping the zombies understand their defenses. "Lock down all internal access points," Chen ordered, her voice cold with fury. "No one moves through the base without escort. We have a saboteur." The implications were staggering. If someone inside had been feeding information to the zombies, then their coordinated attacks made perfect sense. But who would betray their own species? And how were they communicating with the undead? Dr. Vasquez burst into the command center, her lab coat stained with blood and her face etched with panic. "Sarah, we have a problem in the medical bay. 3 of our wounded from this morning's attack. They're showing signs of rapid infection, but not like anything we've seen before. The virus is affecting their brain activity in ways that suggest enhanced cognitive function rather than deterioration." Her words sent a chill through everyone present. "I think some of these zombies are newly turned people who retain their intelligence after infection." The pieces fell into place with horrifying clarity. The zombies' tactical knowledge wasn't just learned, it was inherited from recently infected humans who'd maintained their memories and strategic thinking. Somewhere among the horde outside were former military personnel, engineers, maybe even civilians who'd been captured and turned but retained enough of their human intelligence to plan and coordinate attacks. "Ma'am, we've got movement in Sector 7, Webb reported, his voice breaking with stress. "The zombies are pulling back from the southern breach. They're regrouping." Chen watched the monitors in stunned silence as the zombie horde withdrew to a safe distance, their retreat executed with military precision. They weren't giving up, they were preparing for the next phase of their assault. The power went out again, this time staying dark longer before the generators kicked in. In that moment of darkness, Chen heard something that made her blood run cold, the sound of metal scraping against concrete, coming from somewhere inside the base. The saboteur was still active, still working to bring down their defenses from within. The next few hours would determine whether humanity's last stronghold would fall to an enemy that could think, plan, and strike from within their own ranks. The hunt for the saboteur began in the maze of corridors that connected Haven Base's various sections, each shadow potentially hiding a traitor who'd already cost them their primary defenses. Commander Chen split her remaining forces into search teams, knowing that every minute spent looking inward was another minute the zombies had to prepare their final assault. The base's emergency lighting cast eerie red glows that made familiar faces look sinister, and trust, the foundation of their survival, began to crumble under the weight of suspicion. Sergeant Santos led Team Alpha through the residential quarters, her weapon trained on each doorway as they systematically cleared rooms. Behind her, Private Johnson and 2 civilian volunteers moved with nervous precision, their footsteps echoing off the metal walls. The silence was more unnerving than the sounds of battle had been. At least in combat you knew where your enemies were. Here, in the supposed safety of their home, death could be lurking behind any familiar face. Movement in the engineering section. Lisa Park's voice crackled through the radio, tension evident in every word. She'd barricaded herself in the control room after discovering that critical systems had been accessed using her own security codes. Someone's been using my access permissions to shut down defensive systems. They have to be someone with high-level clearance. The implications were staggering. The traitor wasn't just any survivor, but someone in a position of trust and authority. The first sign of internal combat came from the storage bay, where Chief Rodriguez's team encountered three figures in the darkness. "Identify yourselves," Rodriguez commanded, his flashlight beam revealing Dr. Vasquez, Jake Morrison and communications specialist Mueller. But something was wrong with their posture, their movements too fluid, too coordinated. Dr. Vasquez stepped forward, her face pale but her eyes holding an unnatural gleam. "Tommy, thank God you found us," she said, her voice carrying a strange cadence that made Rodriguez's skin crawl. "We were trying to reach the medical supplies when the power went out." But her words didn't match her position. She was moving away from the medical bay, deeper into the storage areas where explosives and heavy weapons were kept. Rodriguez's military instincts screamed danger, but his human heart resisted the terrible conclusion forming in his mind. The attack came without warning. Jake Morrison lunged forward with inhuman speed, his construction worker strength amplified by something that made his movements predatory and precise. Rodriguez barely managed to dodge the assault, his combat experience saving him from claws that had once been calloused human hands. "They're infected," he shouted into his radio, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. "The saboteurs are infected but still thinking." The revelation sent shockwaves through the base's communication system. The enemy wasn't just outside the walls, it was inside, wearing familiar faces and retaining human intelligence while serving the zombie horde. Dr. Vasquez, or the thing that had been Dr. Vasquez, smiled with predatory satisfaction as she spoke in a voice that was her own yet alien. "You cannot stop what's coming, Tommy. We remember everything, every defense, every weakness, every secret passage. The horde knows all your plans." In the command center, Commander Chen felt the weight of impossible choices crushing down on her. The tactical display showed zombies massing outside the walls while her own people fought desperately against infected colleagues in the corridors below. "All teams, be advised, assume any personnel acting unusually are compromised. Use lethal force if necessary." The words felt like betrayal, ordering her people to potentially kill their friends and colleagues, but survival demanded such harsh decisions. Mrs. Patterson huddled with the children in the reinforced classroom, her teacher's instincts keeping them calm even as the sounds of internal battle grew closer. 8-year-old Emma Chen clutched her teddy bear, tears streaming down her face as she asked the question that haunted them all. Why are the good people becoming bad people? Patterson had no answer that wouldn't shatter what innocence remained in their terrible world. The breakthrough came when Lieutenant Webb's team cornered Mueller near the main communication array. Under interrogation, the infected communications specialist revealed the horrifying truth. The initial infection had been spreading through the base's water supply for weeks, creating sleeper agents who retained their human memories and personalities until activated by some unknown signal. "We are the bridge between what was and what will be," Mueller said, her voice carrying an otherworldly certainty. "Humanity's evolution cannot be stopped." As if summoned by her words, the zombie horde outside began their coordinated assault on the weakened defenses. The infected saboteurs had done their work well, power systems failing, weapon caches compromised, and defensive positions known to the enemy. Commander Chin realized with crystal clarity that they were no longer fighting for victory, but for the chance to evacuate the uninfected to their final fallback position. The base was lost, but perhaps some fragment of humanity could still be saved from the nightmare that had once been their sanctuary. The evacuation alarm pierced through the chaos like a funeral bell, its wailing tones signaling the end of everything they'd built over 3 years of desperate survival. Commander Chin stood in the command center, her finger hovering over the button that would trigger the base's final defensive protocol. A series of explosive charges that would seal the outer sections and buy time for the survivors to reach the inner compound. The decision meant abandoning 2/3 of their home, but it was the only way to save the people who remained uninfected. "Evacuation teams, report status," Chin commanded into her headset, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The tactical display showed red zones spreading through the base like a virus, marking areas where infected personnel or zombie breaches had made passage impossible. Green corridors, the safe evacuation routes, were shrinking by the minute as the enemy pressed their advantage from both inside and outside the walls. Sergeant Santos led the largest evacuation group through the main corridor, her rifle trained on every shadow as 37 survivors, including most of the children, moved in tight formation toward the inner compound. Mrs. Patterson carried little Emma Chin, the commander's daughter, while other teachers and parents shepherded their charges through the nightmare their sanctuary had become. The children's wide eyes reflected the emergency lighting, their innocence a stark contrast to the weapons and grim faces of their protectors. Contact front. Santos shouted as a group of infected personnel emerged from the cafeteria, their movements unnaturally coordinated. Among them was Jake Morrison, his construction skills now turned to deadly purpose as he wielded a nail gun with surgical precision. The infected had been waiting, timing their ambush to catch the evacuees in the narrow corridor where their numbers would be most effective. The battle was brief but vicious. Santos and her team laid down suppressing fire while the civilians pressed against the walls, children crying as the sound of gunfire filled the enclosed space. David Kim, the former accountant who'd found courage in the face of apocalypse, threw himself between the infected and the children, his body absorbing impacts meant for the innocents behind him. His sacrifice bought Santos the seconds she needed to neutralize the threat, but Kim's dying words would haunt them all. Tell them we tried to stay human. In the engineering section, Chief Rodriguez made the hardest decision of his military career. The charges he'd planted throughout the base's outer perimeter could be detonated remotely, but only if someone remained at the manual override station to ensure the sequence completed properly. The automated systems had been compromised by the infected saboteurs, leaving only the manual failsafe that required someone to stay behind. "Tommy, you don't have to do this," Lisa Park pleaded through the radio, her voice breaking as she realized his intention. "We can find another way." But Rodriguez knew better. His 20 years of military service had taught him that sometimes the mission required everything, and protecting the survivors was the most important mission of his life. "Lisa, you get those people to safety," Rodriguez replied, his weathered hands working methodically to arm the charges. "That's an order." Through the reinforced windows of the engineering bay, he could see the zombie horde pouring through the breached walls, their numbers seemingly endless. Among them moved the infected humans, directing the assault with tactical precision that made his heart ache with betrayal. The first detonation shook the base to its foundations, sealing the cafeteria and cutting off one of the main infiltration routes. Rodriguez watched the tactical display as green zones turned red, marking sections of the base that were now uninhabitable but would no longer threaten the survivors. Each explosion felt like cutting away a piece of his soul, destroying the home they'd built together in the name of survival. Dr. Vasquez, the infected version that retained all her medical knowledge, appeared at the engineering bay's entrance, her face a mask of predatory intelligence. "You cannot stop evolution, Tommy," she said, her voice carrying the clinical detachment she'd once used to discuss treatments. "We are what humanity becomes when it sheds its weaknesses." But Rodriguez had heard enough philosophy from the dead. His final act was to trigger the charges that would seal the outer compound, taking himself and the infected doctor with him in a blast that shook the entire base. The survivors in the inner compound felt the explosions through the reinforced walls, each detonation a reminder of the sacrifices being made for their survival. Commander Chin watched the tactical display as whole sections of the base disappeared, her home and fortress becoming a tomb for the heroes who'd chosen to stay behind. The charges had worked, the outer perimeter was sealed, buying them precious time. But time for what? The inner compound was secure, but it was also a prison, and the zombie horde outside was patient, intelligent, and seemingly unstoppable. The sacrifice had been made, but the war was far from over. In the darkness outside, the evolved zombies began their final preparations for the assault that would determine whether humanity's last light would continue to burn or be extinguished forever. The inner compound had become humanity's final fortress, a steel and concrete sanctuary that housed the last 93 survivors of Haven Base. Commander Chin stood in the central command bunker, surrounded by the remnants of her leadership team as they stared at monitors showing the zombie horde's methodical preparation for their final assault. The creatures had learned patience along with intelligence, spending hours positioning themselves with tactical precision that would have impressed military strategists. "Ammunition count?" Chin asked, though she already knew the answer would be devastating. Lieutenant Webb consulted his tablet, his face grim in the emergency lighting. 1,700 rounds of mixed caliber, 42 grenades, and enough C4 for maybe 3 more controlled detonations. At current consumption rates, We have maybe 2 hours of sustained combat before we're down to harsh language and sharp sticks. The inner compound's defenses were formidable but limited. Reinforced steel doors, overlapping fields of fire, and choke points designed to funnel attackers into kill zones. But the zombies outside had shown they could adapt, learn, and overcome obstacles that should have been insurmountable. Worse, the infected humans among them retained knowledge of the compound's layout and defensive systems, making every advantage potentially meaningless. Sergeant Santos moved between the firing positions, checking on the defenders with the calm professionalism that had kept them alive this long. At Station 3, Mrs. Patterson gripped her rifle with white knuckles, her teacher's hands trembling as she peered through the firing slit. "I can see them out there, Maria," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They're not moving like animals anymore. They're planning something." "They're still the enemy," Santos replied, her voice gentle but firm. "Whatever they were before, whatever they remember, they're not human anymore. You remember that when the shooting starts." But even as she spoke the words, Santos felt the weight of doubt. The infected retained human intelligence, human memories, human faces. How many times would they have to kill people they'd once called friends? In the medical station, the few remaining wounded were tended by volunteers who'd learned battlefield medicine through necessity. 8-year-old Emma Chen sat beside her mother, her small hands wrapped around a radio that crackled with updates from the perimeter. "Mommy, why do the bad people sound like the good people?" she asked, her innocent question cutting through the tactical discussions like a blade. Chen pulled her daughter close, unable to answer a question that had no good response. The first probe came at 0300 hours, a small group of zombies testing the compound's automated defenses. Motion sensors triggered floodlights that illuminated the courtyard, revealing a sight that made even veteran survivors gasp. The zombies had fashioned crude armor from salvaged metal, their movements coordinated as they systematically destroyed sensor arrays and camera positions. They weren't just attacking, they were eliminating the defenders' ability to observe and respond. "They're blinding us," Lisa Park reported from her engineering station, her voice tight with professional concern. "Systematically taking out our surveillance network. It's like they have a technical manual for our systems." The implication was clear. The infected humans among them weren't just retaining memories, they were actively sharing technical knowledge with the zombie horde. The breakthrough came not from the main entrance but from below. The compound's drainage system, designed to handle the mountain runoff, had been compromised by infected personnel who'd accessed the construction blueprints. The first sign of trouble was water backing up in the lower levels, followed by the scraping sound of metal being torn away from concrete. "They're coming through the storm drains," Webb shouted into his radio, his voice carrying across the compound. "All units, converge on level B2. But as the defenders rushed toward the lower levels, the main assault began above ground. The zombies had learned the art of misdirection, using the drainage breach as a diversion while their primary force attacked the reinforced entrance. The battle that followed was unlike anything the survivors had experienced. The zombies fought with tactical coordination, using suppressing fire from improvised weapons while assault teams flanked through secondary routes. The infected humans among them called out defensive positions and voices the survivors recognized, turning their own tactical communications against them. "Santos, they know our radio frequencies," Chen realized with horror as enemy voices began broadcasting on their secure channels. "They're coordinating their attack using our own communication protocols." The infected weren't just retaining their human knowledge, they were weaponizing it against their former allies. As ammunition dwindled and defensive positions fell one by one, the survivors found themselves pushed back to the central bunker. The compound's automated systems flickered and died as the zombies systematically destroyed power conduits and control panels. In the growing darkness, lit only by muzzle flashes and emergency lighting, humanity's last defenders prepared for their final stand against an enemy that had learned to think like them while retaining the relentless hunger of the undead. The central bunker had become a tomb of flickering lights and desperate whispers, its reinforced walls the only barrier between the last survivors and the zombie horde that pressed against every entrance. Commander Chin crouched beside her daughter Emma, who clutched the radio with trembling hands as infected voices taunted them through the static. It was then, in that moment of absolute despair, that Emma's innocent observation would save them all. "Mommy, the bad people on the radio sound sad," Emma whispered, her 8-year-old perception cutting through the tactical noise that had consumed the adults. "Like when Tommy cries in his sleep sometimes." Chen listened more carefully to the infected voices broadcasting on their frequencies, and beneath the strategic coordination, she heard something that made her blood run cold: pain, confusion, and a desperate undertone that suggested the infected weren't as unified as they appeared. Dr. Vasquez's voice crackled through the radio, her clinical tone carrying an edge of distress that hadn't been there during their earlier encounters. Sarah, can you hear me? We need to end this. The hunger, it burns, but the memories, they won't stop. Please, you have to understand, we're trapped between what we were and what we've become. The transmission cut off abruptly, but Chen had heard enough. The infected weren't just retaining human intelligence, they were fighting an internal war between their human consciousness and the zombie virus. Lisa, are you monitoring the infected biosignatures? Chen asked, her mind racing through possibilities. From her engineering station, Park pulled up the readings they'd been tracking throughout the siege. Their vital signs are erratic, Commander. Heart rates spiking, neural activity showing massive conflicts between different brain regions. It's like they're having continuous seizures while maintaining cognitive function. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Patterson, who'd been quietly observing the children throughout the siege, approached Chen with a discovery that would change everything. Sarah, I've been watching how Emma and the other children react to the infected voices. They're not responding with fear to the zombie sounds, but with sadness to the human voices underneath. What if the infection isn't complete? What if the human consciousness is still fighting? The tactical implications hit Chen like lightning. If the infected were experiencing internal conflict between their human and zombie natures, then they had a weakness that could be exploited. All units, listen carefully, she broadcast on all frequencies, knowing the infected would hear her words. I know you can hear me and I know you remember who you were. Dr. Vasquez, you saved 43 lives during the measles outbreak. Jake Morrison, you taught my daughter how to tie her shoes. Janet Mueller, you've been sending messages to your sister in Denver every week for 3 years, hoping she's still alive. The effect was immediate and devastating. The coordinated assault outside faltered as infected voices began crying out in confusion and anguish. The human memories Chen had evoked were fighting against the zombie programming, creating chaos in the horde's command structure. Through the monitors, they could see infected personnel clutching their heads, some even turning on the mindless zombies around them as their human consciousness reasserted itself. They're fighting it, Lieutenant Webb reported, his voice filled with amazement. The infected are actually fighting the zombie virus. Some of them are attacking the horde. The tactical display showed the zombie assault dissolving into chaos as infected humans battled against their own transformed nature, their retained humanity refusing to be completely subsumed. Chen seized the moment, broadcasting personal messages to every infected person she could remember. Names, relationships, cherished memories, each transmission was a weapon against the virus that had tried to erase their humanity. The children joined in, their innocent voices calling out to teachers and friends who'd been lost to the infection, their words carrying a power that mere tactical commands could never possess. The final breakthrough came when Dr. Vasquez's voice returned to the radio, clearer now but filled with desperate resolve. Sarah, the virus, it's not permanent. The human consciousness can fight back, but it requires emotional anchoring. We need to remember who we were, why we loved, what we fought for. But there's something else. The virus has a weakness. It can't survive in hosts who experience genuine emotional connection. That's why it tries to isolate us, make us forget. The battle that followed was unlike any they'd ever fought. Instead of ammunition, they used memories. Instead of weapons, they wielded love, friendship, and the bonds that made them human. The infected personnel began turning against the mindless zombies, their human consciousness winning the internal war as they remembered what it meant to be more than just hunger and aggression. By dawn, the zombie horde had been scattered, many of the infected humans freed from the virus's complete control. The cost had been enormous, Haven Base lay in ruins, and they'd lost too many good people. But they'd discovered something far more valuable than any fortress, the knowledge that humanity's greatest strength wasn't its weapons or walls, but its capacity for connection, memory, and love. The information they'd gained would be transmitted to every surviving settlement, giving hope to a world that had thought the war was already lost. The zombies could evolve, but so could humanity's response to them.